video. We are here. Benedetta are back from Dubai, or you are still there? We have some people from. Please. Okay. Okay. Thanks for joining us. Okay, Adriana, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this seminar, this spiel about the future of Europe after the Merkel era. And thank you especially to Professor Brückner for accepting our invitation to be in Catania once again. It's a good opportunity for us to profit from his expertise in this field. Ulrich Brückner actually doesn't need any kind of introduction. However, because this is his third time, I guess, in Catania, and for sure the second time at the high school, the Scuola Superiore. But for those who don't remember, he's a political analyst, is a Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration. He teaches at the Stanford University, both in Berlin and in California, in the main campus in Palo Alto. He also teaches European integration at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and in his very rich curriculum we may read that actually he taught in 3 continents, including China, as he reminded us just a few minutes before. But since it is a pill, I don't want to steal any more precious time, so let me give the floor to Professor Brückner, thanking him again since now for accepting our invitation to be in Catania for delivering this interesting lecture. Thank you, Uli. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's, as always, a great honor and pleasure to be here. Of course, I would have wished to see you guys in person, but it was always a great inspirational conversation we had both at the law school as at the Scuola Superiore. And I want to start without further ado with my slides. Can you see them?
Yes. Yes.
Perfect.
Thanks.
So what I brought today is maybe a bit more than 10 to 15 minutes on Germany after Merkel, what to expect for Europe. And if you have questions that you couldn't ask today, you can still write me an email to my email address and I will see if I have an answer for your questions. What I was planning to go through was, first of all, for those of you who probably have never experienced anything in Germany other than Angela Merkel as the Chancellor, and the daughter of a colleague of mine asked recently if it's possible in Germany that men can become Chancellor, because in her lifetime it has always been a woman, and she thought that this is part of the German constitution, that we only have female heads of government. So this is the reputation of being in power for 16 years. Then I look at the new personnel, the results of the elections for those of you who are not that familiar with domestic politics in Germany, talk about where we are in the negotiations for a new government, because we don't have a new government yet. We are still in the process of negotiations. And then I look into my crystal ball and see what's in for Europe. So, as I said, 16 years in office means that students who currently study have been at elementary school when Angela Merkel was elected. There was no Facebook, there was no high-speed internet, and a lot of things we today take for granted didn't exist when Germans elected Merkel. So in order to understand what we have gone through, both in Europe as in Germany, I listed a number of special moments in the 16 years of Merkel's chancellery, including she supporting the Bush administration in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan against the previous government. She managed a solution for the EU constitutional crisis that today we have as the Lisbon Treaty. It's not called the Berlin Treaty, but it was actually negotiated under her presidency in 2007 that we found a solution that was then handed over to the Portuguese to call it the Lisbon Treaty. There was a lot that needed to be nailed down with eastward enlargement that happened right before she was elected. And most prominently, she played a role in the financial crisis, the Greek crisis. We had an intense discussion in Germany about the nuclear fade out after Fukushima. And what I think most people connect with her legacy is her role in the migration crisis and her famous "Wir schaffen das," we can do it, to follow a humanitarian attitude in migration policy and not to think in terms of, is this dangerous, or do we ruin our economies, or do we have cultural issues with people from foreign countries? If we sign up for asylum policy and human rights standards, then we should live up to this if people come who are in need. This is, I think, one of the most prominent decisions that will always stay with Merkel, and history will tell if that is something that is perceived positively or if it made it difficult to find a European migration regime. Then she played a role with Brexit. She maneuvered transatlantic relations under Trump. And most recently, she was the Chancellor to manage the pandemic in Germany and signed a deal with France that turned into the Next Generation EU additional budget, of which Italy benefits the most. So these are just a few highlights in a much longer list of what we associate with Merkel. That was just descriptive. If we look into the legacy, then one could see that Germany's reputation certainly increased in the last 16 years. She managed to hold Europe together in many crises that could have been the end of the European Union as we know it. So she created a reputation as a crisis manager and also helped to prolong the longest economic boom phase in Germany, which is certainly different from what you would read in history books about the same phase in Italy. And she transformed the Conservative Party from what I said, conservative, into a more centrist party, because she understood that this is where you win elections. When we look from the achievements to the leftovers, she was always referring to her way of policymaking at driving at sight. And that is the opposite of a visionary politician who has a midterm perspective, what she would want Germany to be like in 10, 20, 30 years. Instead, it was only, I do as much as necessary in the moment when I have available information, but I don't think any further, which is okay in crisis management, but it makes it really complicated if you have larger tasks to deal with, like digitization, international conflicts that last longer than an election phase, or if we are challenged in a multipolar world that our understanding of multilateralism is under fire. It also slows down reforms that need more commitment. I'm listed a number of them. And in the end, she left her party in confusion because there was no one who could potentially take over, because everyone was looking at Merkel, who appeared larger than life. And that created partly a situation that the CDU ended in elections with the worst result ever in the history of this party. So when we look at what happens afterwards, we find the CDU still struggling, while the SPD was very quick in nominating a candidate, not expecting that he would ever have a chance to win, but they thought, okay, we need a candidate. The Greens looked for a while as if for the first time Germany could have a Green chancellor, and both candidates have very high support rates, both the man and the woman, and the party left it up to them to decide who will run. And then when the woman won the race, it looked for a few weeks as if she could win the elections, and then we possibly would change into a new era with the Green Party as the leading partner in a coalition. The Liberals raised from the ashes with one man who helped to modernize the party. This is Christian Lindner. And they were always flirting with a more conservative coalition. They didn't like the idea to do something with the SPD and the Greens, but one couldn't predict what the story would be. And on the extreme left and right end is the Left Party that for the first time in their history could potentially be a coalition partner in a coalition of three, while the Alternative für Deutschland is leaning so far right towards neo-Nazi ideology that no one wants to have anything to do with them. And they were kind of marginalized because there was no wave to surf on. As a populist party, they need something dramatic that they can instrumentalize to win the hearts and the emotions of people, which simply didn't happen. So in the end, the campaign was ongoing with three candidates that could potentially win elections. And it was a very close race, and no one could clearly see who is potentially the winner. Annalena Baerbock from the Greens, Olaf Scholz from the Social Democrats, or Armin Laschet, the governor of the largest part of Germany, North Rhine-Westphalia. And in the end, as you can see from the results, the SPD won as a big surprise with a plus of 5.2 points. So they were already marginalized in the previous elections. Both big parties, SPD and CDU, used to be People's Party to offer something to everyone in the country and to mobilize up to 40+% of votes. This is long over in a more diversified society. So for the first time in the history of the country, it was possible that we have many more possible color choices for possible coalitions. And in the end, two options remained technically possible: a black, green, yellow, what we call Jamaica coalition, or a red, yellow, green, what is considered to be a streetlight coalition. But with the devastating result of the CDU and a candidate that no one really liked, it became pretty clear that no one could possibly see Armin Laschet to be the next chancellor, even if they could technically find enough votes. So in the end, Scholz presented the result of the elections as if there is no alternative to a streetlight coalition with him becoming the chancellor, because when you look at the numbers that I showed before, only three parties gained and everyone else lost. And you don't form coalitions with losers. Baerbock was hugely disappointed by a relatively good performance of the Green Party, but far from being a competitor to Scholz. Lindner has a very big ego and was hoping for Jamaica, so it was unclear what their story would be. Laschet walked around as a zombie, not understanding that he has lost, and did not even congratulate the winner because he was still hoping that for whatever reason someone would make Jamaica possible. The Linke was devastated and the Alternative für Deutschland was busy with themselves. They lost 2% and had only a hardcore of people who are against vaccines or have weird ideas about Germany should leave the European Union or whatever nonsense. So they don't really play a role and certainly didn't win anything. After the election night, well, the first thing we got was this photo when two representatives of the junior partners, the Green Party and the FDP, met in private and posted an Instagram picture because they felt so confident that they could choose who they will support as the next chancellor. And that was unheard of because in the past, the leading party started negotiations about coalitions. And so it would have been Olaf Scholz to invite parties to form a coalition. while after this election, the potential winners like Laschet and Scholz were waiting if they find junior partners who are flirting with them and hoping to form a coalition. And after a quick start of forming trust of parties that are not so fundamentally different in what they want, but insist for the show that they are extremely different and have nothing in common, they finally announced that they see a future in a streetlight coalition. So this is the happy winner who's expected to be elected pretty soon based on what is also a German specialty, because we believe so much in the rule of law that we always do not only agree in general what a coalition is planning to do, but we sign a legal binding contract, which is called a coalition agreement. And we currently negotiate coalition agreements, and then it's presented to the public hopefully next week. So I'm coming a bit early. I cannot really tell you much about the content of that agreement, but I can tell you that the positive spirit looks so optimistic that other than last time when I came after German elections, when I was quite confident that this will reach a happy end, in the very end, it was messed up by Lindner and the liberals because they couldn't agree to the coalition agreement and finally left the coalition, and we had to start from scratch again. So what are the conflict points? The biggest question is how much reform appetite do we see both in the German society and in this newly formed coalition? Because especially the junior partners, the Liberals and the Green, insisted on Germany urgently needs reform. All the leftovers from the Merkel years need to be addressed now because all the pressing challenges don't wait for us. Secondly, it is a question of if we sign compromises, and that is the nature of a coalition of three very different parties, not necessarily content-wise, but in their ideology and in their self-perception, how do we sell it to the different wings within the party? And then most importantly for the members of the party, who's gonna get what position and how do we redistribute different parts of competences? Like, is there a need for a ministry of climate change? And what is most interesting for non-Germans, what would be the future role of Germany in Europe and in the world? So when we look at the timeline, it's much more consistent and energetic compared with 4 years ago, when it took long into the following years. We also had elections in September, that we only voted in September. Then they did this trust building thing to build bridges between the opposing ideas of Green and Liberals, while the SPD basically kept silent. And then they negotiated in working groups, more than 20 thematic working groups, with a deadline by the end of the month. And then only after content is nailed down, they talk about positions officially. Whether they talk about posts behind the scene could be, but they didn't want to do it in public. And then they formally elect the Chancellor in the parliament. And then after Santa Claus, we hopefully have a new government. That is what we hope to see happening in Germany. These two guys are now in the driver's seat. The one is expected to become the next Minister of Finance, while also the Green representative on the right was hoping to steer from behind by being the most powerful member and vice chancellor after Olaf Scholz. But it seems as if the Green Party, as some sort of their selling point, rather get a powerful climate policy ministry, while the Liberals control the Ministry of Finance, with far-reaching consequences for Europe, but that's something I will talk about in a sec. So what expect for Europe? I'm afraid the nature of the German political system and also the signal that we got from elections only show small chances for big reforms. They are talking about the need for big reforms, but I simply don't see this happening because we had this asymmetry of media coverage was about young people, and young people are hoping for dramatic changes, while the ones who voted for these parties are old people, because Germany has a demographic imbalance and old people don't see much appetite for drastic changes because they are afraid of losing their status. And aside from, we rather want to slow down the urgent changes with climate, digital, security, trade, demography, pension reforms, like everything is super big and costs a lot of money. We are facing major European challenges. First and foremost, the struggle with Poland and Hungary over the rule of law. Then Macron is about to be re-elected, and it would be a disaster for Europe if Macron would lose and Marine Le Pen or this other special character with a set would win and turn France into something like a mini version of all the populist developments that we see in other countries happening. And we are in a struggle with Russia on multiple fronts, not to speak of China, in which the Biden administration in the US urges us to have a more tougher stance towards China and not see them as a competitor, but also as an important business partner, which was more the Merkel attitude. Then we are in the middle of a discussion about the future of Europe, and we have to see if the Next Generation EU fund is just an exception in a very special moment of European integration, which is Lindner's perspective, or if we can hear something similar from Scholz again, who described the signature of the Next Generation EU deal, the Madison moment of the European Union, that if we expand the budget to such an extent, and if the EU can make something like Eurobonds possible, then we need a stronger legitimacy of this fiscal policy on a European level, which then changes the nature of the European Union. And this will have multiple repercussions constitutionally, as well as about the role of the European Parliament. So as a conclusion, I think that in the coming years, we will look back as Merkel years, as good years for Germany and partly also for the European Union. Maybe not all countries would subscribe to this, but in German history, I think this is what will be left of her legacy. We will have a situation of change coming after those relatively stable 16 years. While the ones who push for this are in a minority, it was only 4% of voters from the age of our students today. And that is not the big game changer if a majority, if it's baby boomers like my generation, and their appetite for change is not as strong as our children and grandchildren's. And Germany's system is not as personalized in politics as it is from how I understand Italian politics or what we have seen in populist transformation systems in Hungary, in Poland, in Johnson's Britain, in Trump's America. This is not what we do. We usually elect an average Joe who's then restricted by the Constitution and the coalition agreement and the self-binding commitment. So in this situation in which the push from the government in terms of leadership is relatively restricted, my prediction is that we will rather become condition takers, that the new government will be confronted by new challenges and either manages it well, or it will be driven by what we don't even foresee is happening. And then it will be a variation of what we got in the Merkel years, simply in a variation that this time it's Olaf Scholz and his junior partners. Scholz will certainly be weaker than what Merkel was in all the different coalitions because he has less support and the others have reasons to be more self-confident and are also pushed by their electorate. Whether this mishmash helps Germany to guide Europe in more stormy times remains to be seen, but I'm personally not overly optimistic if I have to judge the bigger picture. On this not so happy note, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to a lively discussion.
Thank you, Professor Brückner. Thanks a lot. So it's really an interesting sketch